The last thing he heard was not the collapse of walls, it was clay tablets hitting the floor. He was inside the archive when smoke came under the door, shelves to the ceiling, 30,000 pressed records, the accumulated memory of an empire stacked in careful rows. Outside, Nineveh was burning. The greatest library in the ancient world had at most 1 hour left. One reed stylus, one block of wet clay. He pressed a final line. And here is the question that has nagged every scholar since. If this city burned completely, why do we still know so much? I found Nineveh the way most researchers find the thing that changes their investigation, by accident. I was tracing the transmission of astronomical records across the ancient Near East, trying to understand why so many observations from the first millennium BCE matched later Greek sources in ways the standard accounts of independent discovery could not easily explain. The tablets kept appearing in my citations, not as curiosities, as primary sources, and the more often they appeared, the harder it became to think of Nineveh as simply a conquered city, rather than the place where the ancient world's knowledge had been deliberately assembled, and then, against every expectation, preserved. What that preservation required was fire, but I am getting ahead of the sequence. Nineveh sat on the eastern bank of the Tigris River, across from what is now the Iraqi city of Mosul. By the 7th century BCE, it was the largest city in the world. Not the most ancient, not the most sacred, the largest. Its walls ran 12 kilometers around a population that archaeological estimates place between 100,000 and 150,000 people, a number that had no parallel in the ancient Near East at the time. Other cities had walls. Other cities had palaces and temples and administrative quarters. What Nineveh had that the others did not was a library designed from its foundations to be complete. Ashurbanipal became king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire in 669 BCE and died sometime around 631. He lived, in other words, across 6 decades in which Assyria moved from its maximum territorial extent to the first unmistakable signs of structural overreach. He was alive before the cracks appeared, and he survived long enough to watch them spread. That span of time, the distance between an empire at its height and an empire beginning to fracture, is exactly the window in which he built the archive, not as a monument, as a system. He could write. That detail is worth holding. Most ancient kings commissioned texts. Ashurbanipal claimed to have studied the tablet series himself, to have learned cuneiform in multiple scripts, to have read the literature of Sumer and Akkad in the original. Whether the claim was entirely accurate is less important than what it tells us about the kind of archive he built. He sent agents across Mesopotamia with instructions to collect tablets, copy texts, and bring the knowledge back to Nineveh. The British Museum, which holds the largest surviving portion of that collection, describes it as comprising over 30,000 clay tablets and fragments written in cuneiform, discovered in the ruins of the palace. 30,000, pressed by hand, organized into series, labeled, stored. What those tablets contained is the detail that changes how you read every subsequent event in this story. Medical diagnostics organized by symptom and treatment, astronomical observations recorded night by night across decades, with the names of the observers and the atmospheric conditions noted alongside the data. Omen texts analyzing the behavior of animals, the shapes of sacrificed organs, the movements of planets relative to fixed stars, mathematical tables, royal annals stretching back through Assyrian history. And then the copies, older texts, foreign texts, Sumerian literature already ancient by Ashurbanipal's time, copied faithfully onto fresh clay, because the king wanted his library to contain what came before Assyria, not only what Assyria itself had produced. Here is what the standard account of Ashurbanipal emphasizes: the military campaigns, the sack of Thebes in Egypt, the long war against his brother in Babylon. All of that is true. The official record presents Ashurbanipal primarily as a warrior. Reasonable, he was by any measure an effective one. except that the part of his reign that actually survived is not the military record. It is the reading room. The scribes who built and maintained the library were professionals in the strictest institutional sense. They trained from childhood, memorizing the hundreds of cuneiform signs required to write Akkadian and Sumerian, and Ashipu specialized in ritual and divination texts, and Umanu served as a scholar advisor whose knowledge of the omen literature made him indispensable before major decisions. These were not copyists in any diminished sense of the word. They were the people a king consulted before he marched. The palace at Nineveh was built to hold them. Specific rooms on specific corridors were designated for specific tablet series. When British museum archaeologists excavated the site in the 1840s and 1850s, they found tablets still lying where they had fallen, some broken, some intact, the organization of the original shelving still partially legible in the distribution pattern of the pieces. The building had been designed in part around the fact of the archive. Ashurbanipal did not add the library to a palace. He built a palace that the library required. Visitors approaching the gates saw the lamassu first, enormous stone figures with human heads, bull bodies, and eagle wings stationed at every major entrance. Then the relief carvings in the throne room, Assyrian armies crossing rivers, conquered cities in precise and merciless detail, the king himself driving a chariot through a lion hunt that was also, unmistakably, an argument about what it meant to have power over living things. The images told you, before any word was exchanged, that Assyria remembered what it had done. The archive told you that it intended to remember everything else as well. The empire that wrote down everyone else's defeat was about to leave behind the record of its own. Assyria did not become the most feared empire in the ancient world through military superiority alone, and understanding why it fell requires understanding how the fear was built. Not as a byproduct of conquest, as a policy, a deliberate, administered, documented system for ensuring that every people Assyria touched would carry the memory of what resistance had cost. The army was the visible instrument. Assyrian siege warfare was unlike anything the ancient Near East had encountered in earlier centuries. Ramps, battering rams, mobile towers, engineers who could breach walls that other powers considered permanent. The official account of Assyrian military success emphasizes tactical innovation and organizational scale. Reasonable. Except that the innovation that mattered most was not the siege engine. It was what happened after the walls came down. Mass deportations, entire populations relocated from their home territories to distant parts of the empire, replaced by other displaced groups. Uprooted peoples could not organize around local power structures. They could not draw on the land, the temples, the ancestral connections that made resistance imaginable. They were easier to administer and could be settled where Assyria needed agricultural or labor capacity. The administrative records that survived Nineveh document this with the precision of a logistics operation: names, numbers, origin territories, destination assignments. Assyria wrote down everything it did to the people it moved. It kept the receipts. The palace reliefs made the logic visible to everyone who entered the throne room. Images of conquered cities in flames, prisoners in lines, soldiers carrying what soldiers carry after a siege. These were not decorative choices. They were placed where foreign ambassadors and vassal rulers would see them before an audience with the king. The message was precise and required no translation. We have done this before, we will do this again, and we have kept the record. What the palace reliefs could not account for was memory working in both directions. An empire that rules through fear requires that fear to be continuously renewed. Every campaign that succeeded bought time. Every campaign that stalled, every king who died without a clear succession, every subject people that watched an Assyrian army withdraw without complete victory, each of those moments accumulated. Assyria had spent 2 centuries generating resentment with extraordinary efficiency. The question was never whether that resentment would find a political form. The question was when. By the final decades of the 7th century BCE, the answer was becoming visible. Ashurbanipal had fought a devastating war against his own brother, the king of Babylon, and against Elam to the east. Both conflicts drained military capacity that was not easily replaced. The Egyptian territories were lost. Internal succession disputes weakened the administrative coherence that had made the empire function. What had seemed permanent was showing, for the first time in living memory, that it could be pressured. Britannica notes that the Babylonian-led alliance moved against Nineveh after Assyria had already weakened, and that the city fell after fierce resistance. Three powers converged: Babylonian forces under Nabopolassar, Median forces under Kyaxares, Scythian contingents alongside them. Different languages, different interests. One shared history of accumulation. Assyria did not fall because the world forgot it. Assyria fell because too many people remembered. Inside Nineveh, the news arrived in stages. Assur, the ancient religious capital, fell in 614 BCE. The reports reaching the palace were filtered, shaped by the institutional requirements of royal presentation. Kings did not receive catastrophic information in unmanaged form. But the information came. Assur was gone. What else was certain now? The scribe we cannot name would have understood the reports the way a professional reads a text with gaps, by inference, by what the gaps themselves indicated. He had spent his career interpreting partial information. The omen literature he had memorized was built on exactly this, reading what a situation implied beyond what it stated. The rumors in the corridors of the palace in 614 and 613 BCE would have been readable to him the way the shape of an organ was readable to an Ashipu, not as proof, as indication. Messengers arrived, then less frequently, then differently. 612 BCE. The coalition reached Nineveh's walls. The Babylonian Chronicle, one of the primary surviving accounts of the campaign, describes the siege and the final assault. The city held, then it did not. Britannica notes that extensive ash traces from the sack of Nineveh were found in excavated parts of the Acropolis, a layer of destruction so thorough that it was still physically present 26 centuries later when British archaeologists put a trowel to it. Fire moved through the administrative quarters. The palace walls that had displayed Assyrian power to generations of visitors were overtaken by smoke moving faster than anyone inside could direct a response. In the archive rooms the shelves still stood. The tablets were still organized into their series. Somewhere in those corridors, in a room that had been built specifically to hold memory, a man trained from childhood to preserve knowledge was making the only decision left available to him. Not where to go, what to press into the clay that was still wet beneath his hands. We do not know his name. We know the clay. We know what the fire was about to do. The question of what to carry and what to abandon was not a metaphor. It was the practical problem facing every person inside Nineveh as the city moved from siege to sack. The scribes had spent their careers moving tablets carefully, organizing series, copying texts, adding records to collections that had grown for generations. Now the question was simpler and harder. Which of those collections could be moved at all, and where exactly a person carrying clay could go that was safer than where he stood? Clay is heavy. A single large tablet, a multi-tablet omen series, a set of astronomical records, weighs enough to slow a person crossing a burning courtyard. The archive held tens of thousands of them. No one could carry the library. What the scribes could do, and what the evidence suggests some of them did, was press final lines into wet clay even as the building changed around them. Not because pressing would save anything, because they were scribes. Writing under pressure was the one thing their training had made automatic. We cannot name the last scribe who pressed the last line into clay at Nineveh. He is a reconstructed figure, built from what we know about Assyrian scribal training, the hierarchy of the palace archive, the tablets that actually survived, and the physical evidence of how the building fell. He is not an invention. He is the necessary inference. Someone was in those rooms. Someone's hands were the last hands. We do not know the name. We know the clay. The fire reached the archive rooms. The wooden shelves burned. Tablets fell to the floor, cracking on impact, their surface impressions still readable in the broken pieces. The roof collapsed in sections, and then the temperature inside those rooms rose, dramatically, continuously, for hours. This is the part of Nineveh's story that the standard account of military collapse cannot contain. The British Museum, which holds the largest surviving portion of Ashurbanipal's library, explains that while paper books are destroyed by fire, the clay tablets from Nineveh were often baked harder by the heat that consumed the building around them. The destruction that ended the Neo-Assyrian Empire inadvertently produced some of the best preserved documents in all of Mesopotamian history. Tablets that might have crumbled across 2.5 millennia of burial came out of the ground in the 1840s and 1850s readable, pressed with the observations and omens and narratives that Ashurbanipal's scribes had committed to clay. The fire that destroyed the palace preserved the archive. The enemy did not know it. The scribes did not know it. But the clay recorded everything regardless. The empire built its permanence on armies, on walls, on the accumulated fear of subject peoples who remembered what resistance had cost. None of that survived. The king disappeared. The army disappeared. The Assyrian administrative network, the roads and governors and tribute systems that had extracted resources from Egypt to the Iranian plateau, dissolved within a generation. Babylon took the dominant position. The Medes held the north. Nineveh itself was abandoned, its ruins slowly buried, its location uncertain enough that ancient writers debated where it had been. What did not disappear was clay. The medical text survived. The astronomical records survived. The omen series, the royal annals, the copied Sumerian literature survived. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest long narrative work in recorded human history, exists today in large part because Assyrian scribes at Nineveh pressed it into clay for a king who wanted his library to contain what came before him. The empire wanted permanence through power. What lasted was knowledge. The people who carried that history forward were not the ones the empire intended. The Neo-Assyrian state ended. Assyrian people did not. Through the Persian period, through the Hellenistic and Roman eras, through the arrival of Christianity in the ancient Near East, Assyrian communities maintained continuity of language, practice, and identity. Today, Assyrian communities across Iraq, Syria, and the diaspora identify with this past, not as a political claim about ancient borders, but as a living connection to a history that the fall of Nineveh did not extinguish. The survival here is not extinction reversed. It is an unbroken thread. Nineveh burned in 612 BCE. The king disappeared, the army disappeared, the great palace disappeared, but the words stayed. And somewhere in the ruins, beneath the collapsed shelves and the ash layer that archaeologists would find 26 centuries later, the empire made one final mistake. It thought clay was fragile. The archive holds. The tablets remember. And the hands that pressed those lines into wet clay in the last hours of the greatest library the ancient world had produced, those hands are still speaking, in a collection in London, readable and specific, addressed to anyone willing to read what the last scribes of Nineveh actually pressed, instead of what an empire assumed would last.